Hey, it's Vanessa from CraftyGemini.com. Today's tutorial is on how to finish your garments, whether you have a serger or not. So a serger is a kind of sewing machine basically that finishes off the inside seam allowances of your garments. What it does is it has a blade, and as you go stitching on the serger, it cuts away the excess fabric so that when the machine stitches, it encompasses the raw edge and keeps the fabric from fraying. If you don't have a serger, there's still another way that you can finish off your seams, and that's by using a French seam. I'll show you how both of the different seams work. If you're lucky enough to have a serger, then you know how it works and how important it is that you have a machine that will cut your fabric as it stitches. This allows you to finish your sewing garments and other sewing projects very, very quickly. For those of you that don't know what a serger is or have never seen one in action, this is basically how it works. Okay, the one I'm going to be doing now is a 3-thread serger stitch, so you'll see how it works. There's a blade that's cutting the excess fabric. You see it here, cutting it away. And there's the finished edge. Okay, you see it like this. This would be the wrong side of the fabric on the inside of a garment, and then on the outside what you see is that. Obviously you wouldn't do it in black thread on white fabric like this, but I did it so you can see the contrast. Okay, and that's basically how a serger works. So here's an example of a garment that was made and the edges weren't finished, neither with a French seam or any kind of other seam that basically would finish the edge, or using a serger. This is what happens. The seam allowance is stitched and it turns out fine when you see the front side of the garment, okay? But the inside seam is completely fraying, okay? Because the edge of the fabric has not been concealed, either with a serger or using a French seam. So you don't want this to end up happening on your projects. So I'll show you how to do the French seam now. As you can see, here's an example of a French seam. Now on this front side that I'm showing you, there's no raw edges or any fabric sticking out or fraying, okay? And if we flip it over, you see the same thing on the back side. The seam also lays flat and there's no raw edges. That's because the technique used in order to make a French seam is done so that the raw edge, or the side that would tend to fray in your garment, is actually concealed inside this seam. So that's why you don't see it, and it lays completely flat and is finished. Now I'll take you step by step on how you can do this yourself. So here are 2 sample pieces of fabric. Normally when we sew, as you've seen in my previous videos, I always tell you to put the pretty sides of the fabric touching, okay? For a French seam, it's a little tricky at first because you have to get the hang of thinking the wrong sides have to be touching first, okay? So pretend that this is the wrong side. In this case, they're both the right side of the fabric since it's just white fabric. But let's say this is the wrong side and this is the wrong side, okay? That's how you first want to do it. You'll line up your seam, your raw edges of the seams actually, and then you're going to stitch, okay, whatever your seam allowance is. In this case, I'm just going to follow with the edge of the presser foot on the machine and just stitch a straight stitch all the way down. Just like that, okay, a regular seam. Now what you're going to do is you actually want to trim this seam allowance, because that's the raw edge that's going to be concealed in the seam on the next stitching line that you do. And if you don't trim it, it's going to end up coming out of your seam, and you don't want that. So you can either take a rotary cutter or take a pair of scissors and just trim down the seam allowance like that to about 1/8 of an inch or so, okay? Now you'll flip it, and I'm going to kind of finger press this way to get that seam, just like that. Now I'll press it with my iron. Now with that seam pressed out there, I'm going to hit it with the iron to set that seam in place. Okay? Now that I have it like that, I'm going to stitch alongside here. There's another straight stitch. Now as you can see, if I open it, this seam is kind of sticking out, but it still lays flat. So you can either leave it like that. You see that there's no raw edges anywhere on that seam. You can either leave it like that, or like I like to do, I like to stitch this side down as well to keep that inside flat. So I'll just lay it down and just stitch on the edge to hold it in place. And there it is, a French seam. Flat on both sides.